WWE WrestleMania 36 moved. What happens now? On March 16, 2020, the WWE confirmed some shocking news. In the wake of everything that's been going on in the world, the company has chosen to move WrestleMania 36 from its original venue of the Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida, to its own performance center in Orlando. On the company's website, the following statement can be found. In coordination with local partners and government officials, WrestleMania and all related events in Tampa Bay will not take place. However, WrestleMania will still stream live on Sunday, April 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern on WWE Network and will be available on pay-per-view. Only essential personnel will be on the closed set at WWE's training facility in Orlando, Florida to produce WrestleMania. In this unprecedented move, the company is responding to the advice of experts, including both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who have advised that people should not gather in large groups. While the show will still go ahead, the lack of a crowd will mark this year's WrestleMania as the first WWE pay-per-view without a live crowd, in a moment fans never thought would happen. The question now is, what happens next, as the WWE and the world try to prepare for what could be the most unpredictable time in a generation? With that in mind, let's look at what the WWE could have done, what impact this change will have on the company, and what are the long-term ramifications of this historic move. What options did WWE have? Before we look at what happens next, we need to first look at the options WWE had. Of course, the original plan was to host WWE WrestleMania 36 on April 5th in Orlando, and while this could have been a best-case scenario, it would have led to the highest risk of infection. Another option that had been speculated on was postponing the biggest show of the year so that it could still happen with a jam-packed live crowd, but later on down the line. The main problem here is with the booking, as it would have been difficult for the WWE to keep storylines going for months with WrestleMania just a matter of weeks away. This would have been especially difficult for part-time stars such as Brock Lesnar, John Cena, and Edge, all of whom have big matches scheduled for Mania, as it'd be difficult to keep the trio's feuds with Drew McIntyre, Bray Wyatt, and Randy Orton going for months. As part of his new lucrative deal with WWE, Edge is reportedly booked to have 3 matches a year and a handful of appearances, and having the Rated R superstar build up a show that would have eventually been postponed would be a waste of both his and WWE's time. Also, it's impossible to know just when exactly this global medical crisis will die down, and though it's worrying to think about, it's possible that public gatherings could be banned for a very, very long time. While this year's WrestleMania will have no crowd, fans at least now know for certain when the Showcase of the Immortals will take place, and get ready for the biggest show of the year that will take place from the Performance Center. The effect on WWE stock. The past year has been a strange time for WWE's stock. In April 2019, the share value reached an all-time high of $100 per share, thanks in part to the Fox deal and the company's relationship with Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, a series of unfortunate events, including falling attendance and the dismissal of co-presidents Michelle Wilson and George Barrios, has caused WWE stock to tumble. And on the day that the WWE announced their new plans for WrestleMania, the market closed with a stock value of just $30.44. There's a strong case to be made that the global pandemic has been a factor in the WWE's falling value, as since January, just as the crisis was starting off, the company had a share value of $66.54. Since then, as the future of the WWE's biggest show of the year has become more uncertain, it's hardly surprising that the WWE's stock value has fallen too. If WWE are lucky, the company could bounce back, as the market knows that WrestleMania will take place on April 5th. But given how this global pandemic is affecting everyone, nothing is for certain after the pay-per-view. How will the WWE's profits be affected? With WrestleMania not taking place in front of a live audience, this obviously is going to affect how much money the company will make. Historically, the grandest stage of them all has been one of WWE's most profitable nights, not just because of the tens of thousands of fans who pay for their tickets. Once in, there's no shortage of merchandise, including t-shirts, belts, posters, and commemorative memorabilia to entice fans to part with their hard-earned cash throughout the show. And when you remember that WrestleMania is just one show out of a whole week of WWE events, which includes Access, NXT TakeOver, and the Hall of Fame, then the WWE is looking at a serious drop in earnings from last year's show. According to Forbes, WrestleMania 35 brought in a total of $16.9 million, a record gross for the MetLife Stadium, beating the previous record holder of WrestleMania 29 in 2013, which brought in a respectable $12.2 million, and those numbers don't even include merchandise or money made at the gate from other shows over Mania week. Now WWE will have to figure out a way to combat the fact that fans won't be spending their money at the biggest show of the year, though the Tampa Bay Local Organizing Committee has said their relationship with WWE is stronger than ever. In a statement by the committee, fans who bought tickets have been advised on how to get refunds, as this year's edition of the grandest show of the year won't be nearly as profitable as previous incarnations. What will happen to Tampa, Florida? While having WWE move their biggest show of the year to the Performance Center is a big loss for fans who love the spectacle of WrestleMania, spare a thought for the city of Tampa. We all know that the grandest stage of them all is a big moneymaker for the company, but WrestleMania is also a major boost to the economy of whichever city is selected to host the show. According to the WWE themselves, last year's show brought in a hefty $165 million for the New York, New Jersey area. Not only does WrestleMania create jobs in the local vicinity, but it also means an increase in tourism to the city, which means big things for the restaurants, hotels, shops, and other services in the city. Uber and taxi drivers, who are expecting to make some serious money thanks to WrestleMania, won't have that same level of customers, and transport services like these are only going to be hit harder as more and more people are being encouraged to stay indoors. Now, the city of Tampa, Florida will have to go without such a huge windfall as they've lost WrestleMania, though the Tampa Bay Organizing Committee remained positive in their statement, saying, "Our community has waited 36 years to host WrestleMania, and while we are saddened that this unforeseen situation has led us to today's announcement, this is totally the right call for the safety and security of everyone involved. A huge thank you to all of our local leaders and our friends at the WWE, as we collectively worked through the unprecedented fluidity of the last few weeks. The Team Tampa Bay WWE partnership has never been stronger." Despite Tampa, Florida waiting 36 years to host the Showcase of the Immortals, it's hard for the city to fight WWE and Vince McMahon on this decision, but it's still a major loss for the Big Guava. How will the fans be affected? We've already mentioned that the WWE is likely to start issuing refunds, but for many fans, this isn't what they want. While obviously attending a wrestling show shouldn't be seen as more important than someone's health, the fact that many fans will have spent the last year or even longer saving just to go to WrestleMania, a once-in-a-lifetime experience for many fans. If fans who have spent a small fortune to attend the show are annoyed at this decision, it's not hard to see why. And while WWE, experts, and the media can tell people that what is happening is in the best interests for everyone, that fact still doesn't make missing out on being ringside at WrestleMania any easier. What does this mean for the future of WWE? As worrying as it may be, the fact of the matter is that this recent medical crisis may not be over anytime soon. While experts around the world are working tirelessly on a vaccine, companies like the WWE need to be realistic about what they're dealing with. Though it's small, there is a possibility that this medical issue isn't going away anytime soon, and that WrestleMania 36 could be just the first of many pay-per-views to take place without a live audience in attendance. Hopefully this won't be the case and a vaccine will be developed soon, but this is no doubt something that WWE will have to consider. Something positive that may come from this ordeal is that the WWE has confirmed that this year's WrestleMania will take place over 2 days, starting on April 4th and continuing the next night on April 5th. While this is another unprecedented change from the norm, the idea of a 2-day WrestleMania is something many fans have been hoping for a while, especially as the Showcase of the Immortals gets longer in length. Last year's show was the longest WWE pay-per-view in history, and if you include the 2-hour kickoff show, then WrestleMania clocked in at an exhausting 7 hours and 24 minutes. With this year's show now being split into a 2-night spectacle, WrestleMania 36 could prove to be a chance for WWE to see how the crowd feels about 2 shorter shows rather than one long one, and it's possible that WrestleMania 36 won't be the last 2-night WrestleMania even after the live crowd returns. How are the superstars feeling? Though WWE isn't hosting shows with a live crowd, the edict that the show must go on remains. According to reports, all staff who enter the Performance Center are being medically screened, and a report by Post Wrestling has claimed that staff are being given the impression that they can opt out of working without anything bad happening to their career. Despite this very positive stance by the company, and many superstars sharing their support for the move on social media, there are still some who aren't a fan of what's going on. Recently, Lio Rush said he feels uncomfortable competing, given everything that's going on, and we doubt that the former NXT Cruiserweight Champion is alone in how he feels. In addition to this, Roman Reigns is being monitored closely, as his previous battles with leukemia mean the big dog is at a much greater risk of catching the disease than other superstars. Of course, if anyone in the Performance Center does test positive, then there is a high possibility that the company will have to cancel any and all events at the Performance Center for some time to reduce the risk of it spreading. With this year's show being much different than previous incarnations, there have even been talks of matches being cut, as according to Dave Meltzer, a planned women's tag team title match won't be happening on the show. The proposed match, which was supposed to see the Kabuki Warriors defend their titles against Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross, as well as the team of Beth Phoenix and Natalya, may not go ahead after all, but with the show now being a two-day event, nothing is for certain. The WWE has made it clear that the show will go on, but we can't help but wonder what the long-term ramifications will be for the superstars, especially if the pandemic doesn't die down soon. What's next for WWE? To describe the situation WWE finds itself in as odd is a gross understatement. Never before has the company's biggest show of the year been affected in this way, and this is also an issue that is affecting every wrestling promotion, including WWE's chief competition, AEW. Most recently, there's even been talks that the show will be moved once again, and there are rumors circulating that WrestleMania will instead take place in June inside the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Garden. As the wrestling world unites in their common struggle against the disease, the next few weeks and months will be interesting to say the least, as the real-life stories out of the ring are proving to be far more interesting than what any writers in any company could come up with.